Welcome everybody to the second encounters in the series of encounters, a joint project by the Institute of Contemporary Jewry of the Hebrew University and the Institute for Genocide and Memory Study in University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and the Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies in University of Massachusetts at Amherst. In each, this is the second encounter, as I just said. The first one was a month ago, and in each of these encounters, one of us will be speaking with an author of a new book that just came out in the broad field of Holocaust, genocide, mass violence, and the goal is encounter to let broad audience from Israel and the United States encounter new books and their authors in this virtual reality. So this week we are very happy to host in our encounters Professor Eric Weitz, and will discuss his new book, A World Divided, The Global Struggle for Human Rights in the Age of Nation States. And he will converse about his new book with Professor Alon Confino, and I will introduce them in a second. So they will talk about the book for some 50 minutes, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience. At this point, the chat is still open for everybody as I speak. But once the conversation between Professor Confino and Professor Weitz will begin, we'll close the chat, and the only channel will be from the audience to me, or to the host, or it will be Alon, and you can direct question as soon as you feel. So now let me, before I proceed, let me remind you that the next meeting will be on February 9th, next year already, and we will talk about with Leona Toker on her literary book on Gulag and Holocaust literature. You will probably get announcement about that. So now, without further ado, please let me introduce our distinguished guests and Alon. So Eric Weitz is a distinguished professor of history at City College and Graduate Center, City University of New York. Among his many publications, I guess most of you know at least some of them, is Weimar Germany, Promise and Tragedy, published by Princeton University Press 2007, and now it has been translated into many languages, and recently also to Chinese. And it will come out in Chinese very soon. His most recent book, which we'll discuss today, is A World Divided, as I said, The Global Struggle for Human Rights in the Age of Nation State, Princeton University Press, 2019. Since 2007, Professor Weitz has edited a book series of Princeton University Press, Human Rights and Crime Against Humanity. Professor Alon Confino is a Tishkach Chair of Holocaust Studies and Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he is the Director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies. His last book, A World Without Jews, The Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide, Yale University Press, 2014. He's now writing a book on the 1948 war in Palestine. So this is my introduction, and now the floor is yours, Alon and Eric.
Okay. Thank you, Amos. I'm delighted to be here. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. We have guests from Israel, Italy, other places in Europe, the US. So a very good crowd. Let me say just a few words about the book, and then I will hand over the floor to Eric, who will describe the book in more detail, and then we will start the conversation. A World Divided is an intellectual treat. It is a book that deals with that tells a global story of human rights from the end of the 18th century to the present. The historiography of human rights in the last decade or 2 decades have been very wide, very sophisticated, and mostly devoted to specific cases or specific periods or specific countries or organizations. And here we have an attempt by Eric to write a wide, comprehensive, global history with 8 different cases ranging from Greece in the 19th century to Brazil, to Israel and Palestine, to Korea, to Namibia, to Native Americans in Minnesota, a veritable tour de force of historical erudition, trying to put different cases into one argument. I think it is a measure of a scholar who has been in the profession for a few decades and has read so much and has brought to bear this tremendous amount of knowledge. On top of it, as customary with Eric, it's a book that is a pleasure to read and pleasure to delve into cases that you don't know about, whether you are a scholar of Europe reading about Korea, or whether you are a scholar of Native American history reading about Israel and Palestine. There is a way of telling the story that is captivating and interesting. So I'd like to give the floor now to Eric, who will describe the book, and then we will have some discussion.
Thank you both. Yep, in the profession for more decades than I care to count, that's for sure. But first, let me thank Amos and Alon and your respective staffs at your 2 institutes for this opportunity. I've given a fair number of book presentations in the last year and 2 months since the book came out, but this is probably the most global, most international audience that I've had since I've been talking about the book. And of course, given the work of both of you, I'm honored to be invited into this forum. So A World Divided is, as Alon said, it's a global history, and it is a history of human rights. 3 issues animate the book. First is, who truly has the right to have rights? That, of course, is the famous issue posed by Hannah Arendt in 1951 in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Many people, and I'm sure many people in this audience, have cited those pages from Origins. I cite them myself. In a world of 193, give or take 1, 2, or 3 nation states, who truly has the right to have rights? But I do want to mention that 150 years before Arendt, the German Enlightenment philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte said much the same thing when he wrote that the one true right is the right to have rights. So it goes back, that notion goes back long before Arendt. Second issue that animates the book, what do we mean by human rights? We tend to think the answer is simple. In some regards it is: freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, those classic 18th and 19th century liberal political rights. But actually, what we mean by rights is very complex, very dynamic over the course of 2.5 centuries. And each of the chapters of the book takes a different goes into depth about a different feature of the meaning of rights. So for example, whether we mean rights in a collective sense, self-determination, as it came to be understood as the self-determination of nations, not of individuals, as it was in its original Kantian and Fichtean sense. Do we mean strictly political rights? Do we mean social and economic rights? And I deal with social and economic rights in particular in the chapters on Korea and North Korea in particular, the sections on North Korea and on the Soviet Union. Third issue that animates the book: how do we actually obtain rights? We like to think that we get rights from heroic political actors, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King in the United States, the recently deceased Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But in the book, I argue in each of the cases that there was a fleeting confluence of movement activism, including important leaders, state interests, and the interests of the international community, such as it was at any given point in time. And the popular dimension of struggles for rights is something that I emphasize very strongly in the chapters, but find it not sufficient in and of itself to create any of the advances that we associate with human rights. When I gave a presentation in Italy a few months before the book was out, it was actually at a forum, and there were two legal scholars in the audience. And one of them said in his remarks that lawyers like to think that lawyers create human rights. I kind of bit my tongue, but I thought to myself, oh, so it was lawyers who desegregated the American South in the 1950s and 60s. Not that lawyers are unimportant, Lord knows we need them, but, and the legal scholar, said it quite, ruefully and welcoming to my own book. But that popular dimension, again, plays an important role. I don't want to talk too long. This is meant as a conversation, but I'll just finish up these remarks by saying that the book is an affirmative history of human rights, but it also fully recognizes the complexity of human rights. The fact that every advance brings along with it some deleterious impact on other people. That the nation state, as we all know, is an engine of inclusion, but also of exclusion, and sometimes very violent exclusion. So these two factors, the inclusion, the creation of rights-bearing citizens, coupled with the exclusion of others from the national or racial community, is a feature that runs through the last 250 years of human rights and global history. And the book argues that human rights remain our best hope for the future. Some of you who know the literature know that there's been both an academic and journalistic attack on human rights in the last 10, 15 years, often quite vociferous, in fact. That's not my position. Again, the book is affirmative, recognizes the complexity, but it's not triumphant. On the other side, we have some human rights activists who think it's really possible to create the nirvana of human rights, that we will be able, when the day comes, to implement, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its entirety. That's not my position. A restrained understanding of politics is more appropriate. Nonetheless, human rights provide a powerful affirmation of the human spirit. They require that people be respected and afforded recognition no matter what their specific gender, nationality, or race. They demand that everyone have access to the basic necessities of life and have the freedom to express themselves, to work and build and create as they wish, to join with others as they desire, and to be free of the scourge of violence and forced displacement. Those are our fundamental human rights, and we should demand nothing less from the worlds we inhabit. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. I'd like to ask you first to elaborate more on the key argument of the book, that the history of nation states is the history of human rights and vice versa. And you portray the nation state as a Janus-faced historical entity. On the one hand, it's the nation state that confers human rights. On the other hand, it also takes it away from groups, especially ethnic groups, religious groups, who don't belong within the nation. So first, I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit about this argument, and also to ask you, what about human rights that are not limited to nation states and national identities? That is, why to focus on this historical entity, the state, as the organizing principle of the story and the argument?
Working backwards from your very good questions, because the nation state is the predominant political form of the modern era, born in the French American and importantly Latin American revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, then a model that spread through Europe, across Europe in the 19th century and around the globe in the 20th century. So it is the predominant political force. I'm sure many of you are well aware that there's been an enormous amount of historical writing about empires in the last 15, 20 years, about the persistence of empires. And I've certainly learned a lot from reading that kind of work, but I also think we historians have overdone the empire story when it is the nation state that prevails. And it prevails because it strikes deep chords, deep emotional chords in people, of language, of other aspects of culture, of political belonging that empires could never match. Nation states also proved their mettle, maybe first with the French levée en masse, that nation states could mobilize resources and populations in ways that empires could not. So that's why one of the reasons why I focus on the nation state. The other is the Janus-faced character that you just described, Alon. Again, we know the nation state includes and excludes. We can't live with it, we can't live without it. It is the best protector of human rights when those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democratic polities, who are granted citizenship rights, the state is the primary protector. But it is also the supreme violator of human rights. Now, since 1945, this goes to another point that you just raised, it is certainly true that the international community has created various structures, documents, conventions, treaties, institutions, the European Convention on Human Rights, Latin American Convention on Human Rights, and so on. And some of these at least, have moved human rights beyond the nation state. And I do argue in the book that ultimately, while there's no ultimate way out of the Janus-faced character of the nation state, to the degree that we can push human rights protections to the international level, that is an advance for all of us.
I mentioned at the beginning that your book is a little bit different than other books on human rights in the last decade or so, in that it takes really a global approach, and it starts from the end of the 18th century. In this, it reminds us of Lynn Hunt's book from about 10, 20 years ago, in which she saw the origins of human rights with the idea of empathy and of being able to see the other in French and European literature. So it raises a question for those who are familiar with the literature. What does it mean to use the notion of human rights before it has been used by historical actors? So you don't want to define human rights in the book. You actually, as I understand it, and I like it, you want to follow its progression and development in history.
Yeah.
Still, what does it mean that you use human rights before the term is, and isn't it that the term becomes so wide that actually everything can fall within human rights, and we lack a little bit a certain discretion as historians as what to put in and what to leave out.
Yeah. It's certainly a problem that everything can fall into human rights, just as for some people, almost anything and everything is a genocide. And I prefer greater precision about that. What I did not want to do in the book is to get into this debate, although I reference it, of course, quickly. When exactly do human rights begin? You know, some people say 1940s, some people say 1970s, 1990s, some people will say the Hammurabi Code, and then you know, I wanted to move beyond that. I think that can be a sterile discussion. You know, as historians, we use expressions that all the time that were not necessarily used by the historical actors of the day. Nobody talked about the Industrial Revolution in the 1790s or the first decade and 2 decades of the 19th century. But we apply this term because we think it's, although some people will argue about that too, of course, but I still, when I teach European history, I still teach the Industrial Revolution. We apply this term because we think it makes sense. And that's what I chose to do. And I chose to begin in the late 18th century because that's when I think the issue of rights became manifest in politics. We could certainly start, you know, more appropriately, I think, than with the Hammurabi Code. We could certainly start in the 17th century with Locke and Hobbes and others. And that starts a certain intellectual trajectory, but the politics of rights become far more prevalent beginning with those revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. And I also do want to say that although it's certainly true, human rights becomes a much, much more prevalent term after 1945, and then especially after the 1970s. It was used in the 19th century. It was used by abolitionists in the United States. It was used by feminists in the United States. So I figure I'm in good company. If they use the term, I can use the term.
I think it's a good answer, and I think it is convincing. Historians do use and ought to use terms terms that characterize a certain historical phenomena before the term itself was used. We use ethnic cleansing before it was, and there are many other examples. I think in itself, this argument that why does the historian use a term before it was used by contemporaries is not as long as we can find the characteristic of the phenomena discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
But certainly for your argument that you want to link the nation and human rights, so there is a sense here. So you mentioned empires and you mentioned nations, and you are very sensitive to empires in your book as well, not only to nations. So how do empires fit in this story? Since until certainly 1918, we have many empires, and also after the Soviet Empire, and how what is the role of colonialism here as well in the book? Because you give it again as a kind of a Janus face. On the one hand, of course, you are critical of colonialism, but you also say,
so I have been accused of being a colonialist.
Well, we are not going to accuse you.
Thank you.
But you also say that there was a reciprocal relations between leaders, native leaders in the colonies, and the idea of human rights, which was then reused in different ways. So if you can elaborate on these issues that as you just mentioned was indeed was directed to you in various forums and reviews and.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in most cases, nation states were constructed out of empires when various movements exited the empires of which they were a part. I begin with the Greek case, as you mentioned earlier, because it's the first post-Napoleonic nation state. Beats out the Belgians by 9 months. And the Greek rebellion began as essentially a traditional revolt against Ottoman taxes, excessive taxes, and Ottoman brutalities. It was not nationalist in its beginnings. It became nationalist over the course of the 1820s, partly from some Greek political leaders who had experience in France, or at least knew the French model, and partly because they realized that talking about the nation played well with Grecophiles in Philhellenes in Britain, the United States, and France especially. The Ottomans could not defeat the Greeks, and the Greeks would not give up. And that stalemate then opened the way for great power intervention, something the other powers, Britain, France, Russia, did not at all want to do initially, but the stalemate forced them to get involved. And this happens in a number of cases in the book because they desired more than anything else, at least the British especially, desired stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Russians were looking for any excuse to expand the empire. So that kind of back and forth between empires and nation states works through most chapters of the book, including the chapter on Korea, where I focus on Japanese imperialism. Now, empires accept the reality of multi-ethnicity, multi-linguistic capability, multi-confessional. No Russian Tsar, Ottoman Sultan, Chinese emperor ever imagined that all of his and occasionally her subjects would speak the same language, practice the same religion, be of the same ethnicity. Now, they certainly could be oppressive toward the ethnicities or religions that were not, in the Russian case, Russian Orthodox, or in the Ottoman case, were not Muslim, but they also allowed a great range for diversity. The nation state, in the best case, does that, but in so many cases, it is Bulgaria for the Bulgarians and Greece for the Greeks and so on. And the Greek War of Independence, as it's called to this day in Greece, left in its wake destroyed Muslim villages and slaughtered Jewish and Muslim communities. So the very first post-Napoleonic nation state in Europe poses blatantly the question, who is Greek? And it was certainly not in the minds of those who became Greek nationalists. That certainly did not include Jews and Muslims and other minorities.
Eric, you write that the case of Israel-Palestine, and I quote, is perhaps more powerfully than any other case discussed in the book, demonstrates the right intertwining of nation states and human rights. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, and by that I meant precisely the Janus-faced character of the nation state and human rights. That for the Yishuv, as well as for the shattered Jewish communities of Europe who came to Palestine after the Holocaust and World War II, it's very, very hard to imagine, at least this is what I write in the book. It's very, very hard to imagine any option other than the creation of the state of Israel, in which they would be rights-bearing citizens. But that meant, and it meant that deliberately, if one goes back in the book, as I do, to Ben-Gurion's intellectual and political evolution in the 1930s especially, that meant necessarily the removal of Palestinians. So that's the tight intertwining, human rights for some and exclusion for others. In a sense, if I may, let me just say one more thing.
Yes.
In a sense, I wanted to, quote unquote, normalize the history of Israel-Palestine. Yes, it's a very poignant case. It's perhaps an extreme case, but it's not a unique case. It's in some ways very typical about the creation of nation states and rights-bearing citizens in the modern world.
I thought what was interesting in the chapter about Israel-Palestine, as well as in other chapters, but since I'm writing now a book about 1948 in Palestine, let's say I read this chapter very carefully, is precisely this point, that you are trying to portray a global history in which there are no exceptionalism. There are particularities, of course. Korea is not like Israel and Palestine. Namibia will not be like the Native Americans in Minnesota, but there is a kind of there is a pattern that we can talk about, that we can avoid special ways or exceptionalism, and see particular historical events within their broader historical processes. And when you read your chapter about Israel-Palestine, you from the beginning, when you start with the Peel Commission report of 1937, the Peel Commission, the British Commission, which for the first time recommended to partition Palestine and to transfer 225,000 Palestinians from the Jewish state to the Arab state. So you already see what's going to happen in 1948. And why am I saying it? Is because in the historiography of 1948, in some parts of this historiography, there are still debates. Was there really an expulsion or was there no expulsion? And actually, when you read your chapter, you see, well, that's what happened. This, in a way, quote unquote, had to happen because of the specific historical situation.
Yeah.
Seems right to you?
Seems absolutely. I couldn't say it better than you just said it. But you also brought up the issue of colonialism. And my case selection was based on wanting to include all that I could think of as the various political economies of the modern world. Slave societies, Brazil, settler colonialism in the United States, and Israel, Palestine, socialism, communism, and other forms of colonialism. So Namibia figures in there as a case where rights were defined. They may not have been human rights, and there certainly weren't human rights in the way we understand the term today, but whites exercised rights in the German colony of Namibia, while ultimately blacks were proletarianized and subject to a genocide and deprived of any rights whatsoever. So, that's the colonial setting in which we see these complex forces at work.
Eric, the book ends when you say that the tensions between human rights and nation states, so human rights are universal, nation states are more contained political entities, are blatant and cannot be easily resolved, not wished away. They are in fact irresolvable. And you say that perhaps a way into the future is if human rights will be decided or governed or influenced by international bodies. So I wanted to ask you about this ending, whether it's an ending without an end, because after 500 pages, so we end with something so open-ended, and perhaps there is no other way to end it. But it almost reminded me of what you said already about Hannah Arendt's The Rights to Have Rights, that at the end we go back to Arendt and see how correct she was and how illuminating this sentence was, the right to have rights. And that's what we can say, and we don't have much more to say. So if you can...
With two exceptions. Yes, I think we have to live with those contradictions. It seems to me those contradictions are always going to be with us. Look, we're living amid a migration crisis of unfathomable proportions. Every time I rewrote the introduction and conclusion, I had to look at the UNHCR figures for how many migrants, were officially recognized by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. I started out with, I think, 64 million, and I think I ended up at 75 million. And I think yesterday, I think the figure I saw was 85 million, and we haven't seen anything yet. The World Bank has estimated that because of the climate crisis, there may be 1 billion migrants forced out of their homelands because of the climate crisis. So that's just, a very sharp example of the way this is a history without an end, that we will live with this contradiction, but that doesn't mean we live with only the worst side of these contradictions. States will, to stay with the migration example, states, I think, do have a right to control their borders, but it makes a world of difference whether they take that right as license to denigrate people, violently attack people, leave people exposed to the elements and all sorts of other kinds of depredations, or whether they approach the problem from a spirit of humanitarianism and human rights and generosity and figure out mechanisms for recognizing the inherent dignity of every individual that the UDHR begins with, and recognizes, because it is part of international law today, that the stateless do have rights. So by history without an end, I don't mean to suggest we just throw up our hands and live with whatever we've got, but that to forge a responsible and humanitarian path forward means, at the very least, recognizing these complexities. I also think, as I mentioned earlier, that whatever does move human rights protections to the international level gets us, some steps out of this quandary that Janus faced character of the nation state.
Eric, I wanted to ask you about the process of writing a book in which many sections of which are not in your field of expertise. It's one thing to write about, you are a historian of Germany, of Europe, of genocide, of human rights, but to write about a chapter about Korea, I imagine it was challenging. So what was it like for you as a historian? How did you approach it? How did you approach the fact that you don't read the language? You have to rely on what's available in English. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I approach it with trepidation and humility. Okay, I'm a historian, and I believe in our commitment to linguistic and cultural expertise of the places we work on. But I also think, and obviously this is not a book I could have written, early in my career. I also think that it's liberating and incredibly interesting to step out of the areas on which one is an expert, and to learn new histories and to run with it as far as you can. And then readers have to judge. Readers have to judge if, moving to quite a number of the chapters are areas where I don't have the linguistic expertise. Readers will have to judge whether that works or doesn't work. I'll also say it helps a lot to have friends and colleagues like you and others who are expert in these areas and with whom one discusses, in conferences and workshops, but also people I can go to for bibliographic advice, people who read chapters. My friend Tana Akçam, who read the chapter on minorities, a Turkish-born scholar of the Armenian genocide, Shel Garin, who's a historian of Japan at Princeton, who read and did not like at all my chapter on Korea. But one learns from that. And it also helps enormously, and I'm very fortunate in this regard because I live in Princeton, and I had access to the Princeton University Library, which is just phenomenal. I think many of us, I certainly do, complain that our undergraduates don't know the advantage and the joy of just standing there looking at what's on the shelves. So, when I went to the section in the Princeton Library on Korea, and I'm looking there and I'm finding, oh my gosh, there's a 2-volume translation in English of Korean Communist Party documents. And there are 8 volumes of letters from various political leaders that translated into English. So one really does need a very good library.
Let me ask you a final question that would lead us to the Q&A. So I'll take this opportunity to ask everybody to think. And if you have a question, please, that's the time. We have already some questions and we would like to have more. So far, what were the reactions of scholars or non-scholars to the book? Things that surprised you? When we write a book, That's it. It's in the public realm. And what we think our interpretation is, oftentimes very different from what other people think our interpretation is. We all know it from reactions that we get and from book reviews. So what were some of the things that you learned or that you deciphered?
Well, I'm still waiting for a lot of the academic reviews. The book has just been out a year. And yeah, as we all know, even in the digital age, the historical journals are incredibly slow. There have been a few fora on the book. I tend to polarize reactions in almost everything I've written. That people either like it a lot or they really don't like it. Nobody's ever accused me of being boring, so I take that as a major compliment in absentia, so to speak. There's been a lot of criticism about, and I think misunderstanding about the cases. Some people have thought the cases are esoteric, even though I thought I had explained in the introduction why I chose particular cases, partly because small places, and you certainly know this about Palestine, Israel, small places can become then the fulcrum for great power contestation, as Greece was in the 1820s, as Korea was from the 1890s onward, as Palestine, Israel was and is. So there's criticism on that. Criticism, back to these issues. I mean, you raised it, that I'm talking about human rights when human rights did not exist, according to some critics. So, you know, that kind of thing. I think what one would expect. I've also, not just in this book, but in others, have been criticized because I don't deal in depth with the historiography. Well, I think I've been fortunate, very fortunate to have an editor, and as you know, who also happens to be my wife, who has encouraged me to, and is a ruthless reader for sure, has encouraged me to write well and write for a broad audience and just leave the academic back and forth for the footnotes. I'm sure there will be people who are offended that I don't cite them or that I don't engage in depth with them, but I really did not want to write a book where, you know, he said that and she said that and I say this. You know, we're all trained that way when we write dissertations, but I also think there's a time you can leave this, say goodbye. And it's not like I didn't write without footnotes. There are plenty of footnotes in the book.
I sympathize.
I thought you would.
We have a very interesting question for my esteemed colleague, Stephen Klingman from UMass, who asks you, you talk of a certain inevitability in Israel-Palestine around human rights. The inclusion of some meant the exclusion of others. However, if we take the South African model, we perhaps see something else once the transition out of apartheid took place, that the rights of some could be coterminous with the rights of all. So can't history develop in different ways? What looks inevitable may just be one version of the possible.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. And I certainly would not want to be stuck in solely in the historical present and to argue that, you know, what we've got is what we have and that's it. And I think in the chapters I've tried very hard to show the way that human rights evolve in different places around the globe. And I mean, I dealt with Namibia in one of the chapters, and South Africa, of course, is there playing a role also. And Namibia, for as impoverished as it is today, as enormous are the land issues, the public health issues. You know, one can say at the very least that everyone is a citizen. And that includes the ex-Nazis who went to Namibia after 1945. It's a very strange place in a lot of ways. When I was there doing research, you go into stores and you see Nazi memorabilia and things like that. It's rather unnerving. But I take your point. I think it's well taken. But nor do I want to go too much down the prediction lane. I often tell this story. I just come back from East Germany doing research in 1989. I was teaching a class in German history, no less. And in October 1989, I told that class that the Berlin Wall would be with us for the rest of our lives. And then 3 weeks later, shoop, all gone, all gone. So I don't want to be too predictive in the book.
Amos, you had a question.
My question, my question is, you posed some kind of tension between the nation state or the nation and human rights, but can you elaborate a little bit about the tension between collective and human rights, collective rights and human rights?
Yeah. I deal with that especially in the chapter on Native Americans and the Dakota War of the 1860s and the removal of the Dakota Sioux from Minnesota and what we would now call an ethnic cleansing. And then I go on, this is another instance where one really learns a lot. It's good to have colleagues in different fields because I began the book when I was teaching at the University of Minnesota. University of Minnesota has the first Department of Indian Studies in the United States, and I had a number of excellent colleagues there whose works I plumbed for writing that chapter. The dilemma here is that almost probably every human rights activist thinks that indigenous rights, which are collective rights, right? They're the rights of particular people, where we're talking about groups in the Amazon, or we're talking about Native Americans, or Native Canadians, that these groups should have sovereignty over the territories in the United States, the tribal territories that many of these groups still have. And that I'll just use the American example that Native Americans, the sovereignty of the reservation is fiercely defended, and it's a collective right. But because I won't go through the complex legal history, which has never been resolved, because tribes are sovereign nations, the international human rights conventions that the United States has signed, and there are many we haven't signed, but that they have signed, don't apply. They don't apply on tribal territory. So in many cases, especially women whose rights, Native women whose rights have been violated, don't have recourse to the international standards of human rights if they're resident on the reservations. So here we have, again, it's hard to see how this can be ultimately resolved, this clash between human rights understood first and foremost as the rights of a collectivity, the nation, from which then individual human rights derive, versus a notion that individual human rights have primary status. I think it's an irresolvable dilemma. One more complexity in the history of human rights.
Eric, could you please say a few words on the title of the book? What do you mean by a world divided?
Divided in many, many ways. Divided in the sense divided into nation states, divided into citizens and non-citizens, divided into multiple ethnicity, confessional groups, and how all of these divisions then work through or are worked through or not human rights standards.
Eric, do you have thoughts on the intersection between Holocaust memory and human rights? Is there anything particular that we should be aware of, or did one influence the other, or not?
Well, I think there's no question that the Holocaust, which was of course unnamed at the time as the Holocaust in the 1940s, that it's absolutely critical to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and critical even though the annihilation of the Jews and again the unnamed Holocaust was not central to the Nuremberg trials, that the recognition was there concerning the annihilation of the Jews. And when the drafting of the UDHR, which remains the touchstone along with the two 1966 conventions, touchstone for the post-war human rights regime, that when the drafters of the UDHR talked about the dignity of the individual and the universality of that dignity, that what we now call the Holocaust was in the minds of most, if not all, of the drafters. In the book, I quote the Soviet diplomat Anastasis Mikoyan, who people might be surprised to know in 1947, during the debate on the partition of Palestine, gave this very moving speech about the annihilation of the Jews in World War II, the inability of the Western states to defend Jews, and the fact that Jews now deserved their own state. He said, hopefully a state that would include all groups, but if not, the Soviet Union was willing to accept partition. People write this off as mere Soviet propaganda. I don't write it off because I think it was completely in line with the Marxist understanding and the Soviet understanding of the nation state from Marx and Engels in the 1860s straight through Lenin and Stalin. So even with Mikoyan in the Soviet position in the 1940s, you see that recognition of the Holocaust. And it's, not saying anything people don't know to argue that the very rich historiography, and not just historiography, the very rich academic work on the Holocaust, historical, literary, philosophical, has without question, I think, helped shape the understanding of human rights in the modern era.
It seems to me that there are two stages here that are connected but not identical. One is the impact of the extermination of the Jews in the 40s, after 45 into 48, 49. And one, whether or what were the relations between Holocaust memory, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, and human rights. Both of them get a huge boost, and maybe there are some relationship. Perhaps there is something to explore here.
Yeah, I think so. Though some people would argue precisely the opposite. I don't agree with them, but they say that and the recognition of the Holocaust has become so overwhelming, so huge, that it has prevented recognition of other violations of human rights around the world. And I actually don't think that's the case. That requires a lot of argument.
Eric, changing a topic, there is a question here about the effectiveness of human rights during the League of Nations era. Usually the League of Nations is perceived as a failure in terms of human rights. Wondered, what was your reaction? Maybe you can say something about the link between self-determination and minority rights for those who don't know, because this is the key argument of the book and also of your writings before the book.
Right. Yeah, what Alon is referring to is two articles in the American Historical Review, one from the Vienna to the Paris system, and the other an intellectual history of the concept of self-determination. And I argue that the minorities treaties and the Lausanne Agreement, the first international recognition of what we now call ethnic cleansing, the so-called exchange of Christians and Muslims from between Anatolia and Greece, that these are the two sides of the same coin. That if you can protect minorities through the treaties, fine. If you can, leaving aside, of course, the opposition of Poland and the fierce opposition of Poland and other countries to the minorities treaties. But if you can't, or if you don't want to, then the other thing, or if the minorities are too large or too rebellious, then you get rid of them. Okay, get rid of them through ethnic cleansing. Could get rid of them ultimately through genocide. So these intrinsic or the central aspects of the League of Nations, even in its heyday in the 1920s, embed into the international system the dilemma that is central to the entire argument of the book. Again, the Janus Face character of the nation state. And for decades and decades and decades afterward, the Lausanne Agreement was seen as highly successful. And indeed, there's some evidence for that, because Greece and Turkey did not fight a war until the sort of war of the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in the 1970s. So diplomats thought of this as the way you deal. They thought of this as the way you manage ethnic conflict. But more than that, they thought of this ethnic cleansing, that is, as the way to secure, to make stable liberal states. And Ben-Gurion, a number of times, and I cite a couple of times in the book, Ben-Gurion says, look at the Lausanne Treaty. What they did, we'll do. It's a perfect model for us. And during the height of the Iraq War in the first decade of this century, American policy planners were thinking of partitioning Iraq in this and moving around populations. So Lausanne had a very long-lasting history. It was certainly in the mind of I'm blanking on his name, the famous American diplomat who died suddenly about 5 years ago, who negotiated the Dayton Agreement. Lausanne,
with an H, yeah.
Anyway, it was certainly in his mind.
Holbrook.
Yeah, Richard Holbrook. Thank you.
Thank you, David Fry.
Yeah, Holbrook. Somebody came up with a name. Thank you. That's what comes from being in the profession for many decades.
So it was on his mind?
Yeah, I'm almost certain. I mean, he was a very smart guy, very learned guy.
Yeah.
It was certainly David Owen, who David Owen said something expressly about Lausanne. Now the Owen plan failed. It was much too complicated. So, who was British Foreign Secretary at the time in the early 1990s, and then so the diplomatic efforts passed to Holbrooke. And I can't say I have the evidence for it, but I'm almost certain it was in Holbrooke's mind, and it was most definitely in David Owen's mind.
Yeah. Eric was referring to the war in the Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and the Bosnian and the Serbs, and how to reach an agreement. Yeah. Eric, to what extent the development of laws of war from the 19th century on, the Geneva Conventions and others, influenced the development of human rights? Is there a connection here?
Yeah, I think there is a connection. We often make this distinction between humanitarianism and human rights, and I do believe there's a distinction. In my mind, human rights there's a tough character to human rights. People don't beg for human rights. They're not supplicants. They're not asking for another bowl of soup, whether it's from, and I don't mean to sound too cynical, although this will sound cynical, whether it's from Oxfam or from the emperor of whom they are a subject. Human rights say to people, you are a rights-bearing citizen, and nobody has the right nor should have the power to abrogate those fundamental human rights. And humanitarianism, about which there's much writing, often involves a kind of giver and supplicant kind of relationship. Nonetheless, the lines are often blurry. They're not as stark as I've just described them. And to the extent that humanitarianism, like human rights, believes in the integrity, bodily, psychologically, emotionally, of the individual, there is most definitely a relationship between the two. And in international legal terms, the Fourth Geneva Protocol of 1952, I may be off by a year or two, but I think 1952. The Fourth Geneva Protocol is sort of the last major event in this human rights surge that begins in 1944 with all the discussions that will lead to the UDHR, to the Genocide Convention, to the Nuremberg trials, and then including William Hitchcock has made this argument, and I think it's a good argument to include the Fourth Geneva Protocol in that realm of a human rights surge in the immediate post-war period.
Eric, could you imagine a rights-bearing citizen of something other than a nation state, say a citizen of Europe, the European Union?
Well, that's the thing. You still have to be a citizen of a European state to come under the full panoply of rights available to EU citizens. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course. There are some places where where residents, even when they're not citizens, are permitted to vote in local elections or are permitted to vote in EU elections. So there are some exceptions. But I at least find it hard to imagine a European citizenship absent first of nation state membership, and even harder to imagine something like global citizenship. It's a nice idea, it's a nice slogan, but it is very, very hard to imagine it.
I just want to raise a thought that, so we have the nation state both as conferring rights and taking rights. Obviously, those whose rights are being taken, they are victims. But there is another group which seems incredibly unfortunate. Those that don't have a state at all, the stateless.
Right.
Those under occupation or immigrants that have no legal status. How do they figure in there?
Technically, the stateless do have some rights based on the 1952 UN Convention about statelessness. So this is part of what I talked about, the move toward some rights protections at the international level. In practice, however, that's more theory than reality. And, as those of us in the United States know, just from looking at the way the migration issue has been handled in the last few years. But as Hannah Arendt wrote, to go back to her again, statelessness is the worst condition one can be in, just shy of being a victim of genocide. And I think those passages in Origins of Totalitarianism are truly brilliant and remain a benchmark for all of these discussions.
There's a follow-up question, Eric, that to the discussion about the League of Nations. What do you think about the Nansen concept of universal rights within citizenship?
Yeah, I think the Nansen concept is very good. I think a Nansen passport.
Say something about it, Eric, for those who are not familiar.
Okay, so Fridtjof Nansen, Norwegian explorer and diplomat, was named the first League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And his remit at first was to deal with especially the white Russian emigres from the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War. So Nansen came up with what became known as the Nansen passport. So a document given to stateless migrants, which at least provided them with some identity papers, some recognition as international, if not nation state citizens. There are some memoirs I've read where some individuals were very contemptuous, who held the Nansen passport, were contemptuous of it because it still left them unprotected. But I think the larger reaction was that this was a great step toward, even though I just disparaged the notion, toward global citizenship. And I think, absolutely something like the Nansen passport today would be a huge improvement over 85 million migrants left homeless in the current period. And as I said earlier, you can build all the walls you want, but the climate crisis is just going to lead to the dramatic acceleration of those numbers and of people on the move.
Okay. I don't want to end in this note, but I will recall that Amos said that in early February we have another event. And when he said it, I thought, early February, who knows? Maybe there will be a vaccine. We will all dine out in restaurants and meet our friends and have parties. That's the
hope springs eternal.
Exactly. Eric, thank you so much. It was illuminating and marvelous. We learned a lot. We are very happy that you joined us. Thank you.
And thank you and the audience for the wonderful questions.
And thank you all for participating, and see you in our next event. Bye.
Bye now.